Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome everyone here to our roundtable discussion for the Markaz Reviews issue number 41, which is called Forgetting. I have four guests here today who have written four very beautiful essays for this issue, which I have to say is one of the strongest issues that we've put out. And there was a lot of food for thought. And it was really interesting for me as well to reread everybody's work in conversation now with one another. And I hope you guys will enjoy this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'd like to introduce all of our speakers, all of our writers today. So we have Mai Al-Nakib with us. She was born in Kuwait and spent the first 6 years of her life in London, Edinburgh, and St. Louis, Missouri. She holds, or is it St. Louis? I think it's St. Louis.
St. Louis.
She holds St. Louis. Okay. She holds a PhD in English literature from Brown University. She was an associate professor of English and comparative literature at Kuwait University, where she taught for 20 years. She recently left this position to write full-time. Her research focuses on cultural politics in the Middle East with a special emphasis on gender, cosmopolitanism, and post-colonial issues. Her short story collection, The Hidden Light of Objects, was published by Bloomsbury in 2014. It won the Edinburgh International Book Festival's First Book Award. Her debut novel, An Unlasting Home, published by Mariner Books in the US and Salih in the UK, came out in paperback in April 2023. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in various publications, including Ninth Letter, The First Line, After the Pause, World Literature Today, Riwayat, New Lines Magazine, and the BBC World Service. She divides her time between Kuwait and Greece, and today she's coming to us from Kuwait. Saleem Haddad is a novelist, screenwriter, and essayist currently based in Lisbon with roots in Amman, Beirut, and London. His award-winning debut novel, Guapa, was published in 2016. We also have with us Asmaa Elgamal, who is a writer and scholar from Alexandria, Egypt. She earned her PhD in International Development and Planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where her research explored the colonial and military histories of spatial planning in the Middle East and North Africa. Her writing has appeared in New Lines Magazine, Contingent Magazine, and Insider. She was also longlisted for the 2021 Disquiet International Literary Prize for Nonfiction. And last but certainly not least, we have Nabil Salih, who is a writer and photographer from Baghdad. Nabil holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown and is pursuing a second MA in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College. His writings appear in Jadaliya, Allegra Lab, Al Jazeera English, and Left East, among others, and have been translated to Italian, Spanish, French, and other languages. So welcome, everybody. It is very, very nice to have you here. Let me see. I have lost you all now on my screen. There we go. So we're here to discuss issues around the theme of forgetting. I thought it was really interesting. We usually normally try to limit it to 3 guests, but it was very difficult to limit it this time, and it felt really important and interesting to have all of you guys come together for this discussion, not just because you know, we all loved your essays so much, but I think also because when I was looking at everybody's profiles, I realized like what a huge swathe of countries everybody encompasses here. So we have Asmaa from Egypt, Nabil, Iraq, Saleem from Lebanon, Palestine, and Amman. For me, I think of you as Palestine via Lebanon, but you've also spent time in Jordan, correct? So growing up in Jordan. Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
And Mai from Kuwait, who also, talks about, and everybody somehow is at the same time, connected to the issue of Palestine because of its place and geography in the Arab world, because of the way it's been a political centerpiece of so many different issues, because of the way that it's affected, let's say, government policies and the ruling regimes, and the entire politics of the Arab world has been shaped by this and by these kinds of and so I thought it was, and all of these countries as well that we're talking about all have questions about national memory, about collective memory, about forgetting, about reconciling the past, about how do we move into the future and, reconcile collective memories among, let's say, many different clashing groups when there has been histories of conflicts, between different kinds of people. And so I thought it would be really interesting for all of us to have this discussion, you know, together. And as I said before, also reading your essays against one another, I thought was quite interesting because they all spoke to one another, and they all of them kind of problematize to a certain extent the idea of memory as a virtue in and of itself. Um, so I would like to actually start with you, May, because your piece kind of sets the tone for this idea that memory in itself is not a good in itself. Can you talk a little bit about you speak about you use the framework of rewatching Wim Wenders' film Until the End of the World, and you talk about how the first time you watched it, you had your sympathies lay with the characters who were trying to create this like kind of forensic retelling of the past, right? Where it was like, this is the truth, this is what happened, this is how we put it down. And then later when you watched it again in the middle of a genocide and after having grown up and lost your own mother, and kind of you had a completely different understanding. So can you kind of explain that and talk about what that was and why you kind of took a step backward from that way of looking at memory?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lina. So it was everything that I've been thinking about, everything that I do at the moment is obviously colored by the disaster that's been ongoing in Gaza. Rewatching the Wim Wenders film, and I don't know what it is. I watched his film that came out, Perfect Days. I don't know, it just recently came out. And that alone made me think about how in Gaza, nobody is allowed to have the simplest perfect day, right? For this character, the perfect day was, he cleans toilets and yet he sees beauty in the trees that he takes pictures of. It's a small life, but it's a beautiful life. That connected me back to the Wim Wenders film that I watched after the liberation of Kuwait. And when I was 19, I think I was 19 or 20 when I first watched that film, I was attracted to the idea of this machine that would capture your dreams, your images of your past, that you could then replay and watch over and over again. And I would have given anything to be able to have that capacity to retain my memories, maybe because of this traumatic event of the invasion that had happened that I had just come through. And then later, even 10 years later, when my mom passed away, I had the same thinking. I remembered that film. That film has always stayed with me. And I had the same kind of connection to this machinic memory, let's say, this ability to hold on to all the memories without losing a single element of it. Watching the long director's version of Until the End of the World, which is almost 5 hours long, which is slower paced, very different, and it was kind of overwritten with my earlier watching of it, I couldn't have had a more different response. And my sympathies lied with the Mbantua indigenous people of Australia, the first peoples of Australia, and they had the complete opposite reaction to this machine. Their sense was that we don't want our memories recorded. You have no right to colonize our memories. There's a violence to that, taking of who we are. It's a kind of identic theft. And their sense of memory is sort of communal. We pass it down through the stories that we tell generation after generation. And there was something sort of very connected to the geography of the land, to the sense of their relationship that goes over thousands of years and on, so my sense of that relationship to the tyranny of memory, which again, we think of Zionist remembrance imposed at the expense of Palestinian existence. There seemed to me to be a parallel between those two kinds of memory. And, one being this violent, never forget, versus a memory that has to do with the land, has to do with something that's generational, that's passed down, that's loving, that's communal. And so I completely felt like that machinic memory was something I really couldn't stomach. It really left me sick in a sense, you know, and that's how I started thinking. And really that was the impetus for me to write this essay, making all those connections, sort of trying to thread all of those layers together through that film.
I mean, it's a beautiful essay, and it gives there's so much food for thought there. Like already, you know, and it's funny you bring up this idea of a perfect day, because it made me think actually Saleem talks about this idea of like the ordinary, recording of the ordinary, like because Saleem's essay is a book review actually of Sami Hedmez, who wrote a book with Sireen Sawalha called My Brother, My Land. And so you write, Saleem, there is political value in recording ordinary memories. And it's true, like under the shadow of like, you know, of this ethnic cleansing, there definitely is this idea of like, what is a perfect day? But actually, the other thing that you said is makes me think of what Nabil wrote, which is very much this idea. So Nabil's essay regarding the photographs of others, I was so, I mean, I told you this, I was so compelled by this piece. I think for me also, you know, as a Lebanese person, reading reading this history of Iraq, reading it, not just, you know, as a Lebanese person, I say because of this idea of like how do you reconcile a history of trauma and a history of civil conflict in a country and like continue to live with one another. There's that. But also, I mean, for all of our correct me if I'm wrong, but for all of our political consciousness, I think, you know, of kind of a similar generation, before there was Gaza, there was Iraq, and there was the you know, watching this what felt like an unstoppable horror of the tanks rolling in, and knowing that this was going to be a disaster reverberating for decades, and everybody protesting and everybody yelling and everybody saying no, and like being unable to stop that. And Nabil, you create this, like you talk about, you juxtapose these two ideas, which is how Iraqis remember, right, versus how the West remembers its crimes against Iraq. Can you talk a little bit about that and about your essay before we kind of, I have another question for you, but can you kind of talk about the thinking behind this piece and where it came from and what you were trying to do with it?
Hi, Lina. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be among these wonderful writers as well. I mean, it's what May was saying and what you were saying about Saleem's work. It's the colonization of memory. It's recording the ordinary, which is a privilege that unfortunately we do not have to a certain extent. May, in her beautiful essay, wrote something about or mentioned Proust, and Benjamin was Walter Benjamin was very influenced by Proust. There was a monument for the Marine Corps in on the tip of Virginia where I lived for in the DMV area for 2 years. I used to go there and see the Nights of Washington, D.C. And there's this one instant where a kid was holding her parents' hands, and they were walking in the pathway, and her shoe sent flashes of colors, you know, the shoes that we wore or wanted to wear when we were under sanctions in school. And the night, and suddenly, as Benjamin says, the pathway was precipitous, leading to a past of childhood. And I often return there, you know, living in the two places in a way, as Sinan Antoun says, actually. And I try to safeguard what little memories I have from, you know, again, to quote Antoun, you know, in this recess between two wars, between the Gulf War and between 2003, which when it happened, I was at the time 11 years old. But can we remember that? You know, every time I try to think of these fleeting, beautiful moments, for example, having lunch in spring outside in the garden, the smell of orange trees and orange trees and blossoms in the street, all of that requires passing back through dangerous terrain that remains smoldering. You know, you pass concertina wires to to reach there. And it wasn't an easy piece to write. It's certainly not an enjoyable one to write, and I hope that I will not spend my entire life writing about this because it's heavily taxing. But again, I mean, 91, as May wrote, citing Baudrillard, there was this hyper, the Gulf War that never happened. It was more of the postmodern world's hyper reality, a clean, a sanitized spectacle, where we appeared computerized, and it was unpatriotic to show the faces of the enemy in newspapers in the West. And then 2003, and another sorts of memories were imposed on us, and somehow to say Iraq, all that is synonymous with the word is pain, bombing, and spectacular violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's that becomes like a very difficult thing. I remember, being in Istanbul in 2003 and walking, and there was a guy who was selling water, and he asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Lebanon," because I knew that that's how they said it. And he looked at me and he said, "Lebanon." And then he said, "Oh, Lebanon, Ariel Sharon, boom, boom, Lebanon." And, in a way, we all come from countries like that, right? Like in the West is like people, when they don't know your country and they associate it with that, there's something so extremely reductive about it. And that's what I found so interesting about your essay, is that you were, because you talk about that kind of this idea of like, who has the right to memory. This is what it brought up for me as well. Who has the right to kind of talk about a memory of past trauma, right? And this is the question also that Mai talks about in terms of the Holocaust, in terms of never again. That never again becomes the thing that allows the new kind of horror of the Nakba to continue. But so this, what how is, let's say, if we're going to talk about the perpetrator of any crime, right? Who is it that has the right to the memory of what happened? Is it the victim? Is it the perpetrator? Is it the people who come after both? If we're going to talk about places being, and obviously I'm uncomfortable with these terms, victim, perpetrator, because they're very kind of categorical, but this idea of who is it that has a right to memory? For me, your essay brought up that question. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. There is, beyond the imperial history of the victor as well, there is the state's official narrative, which denies that what happened in 2003 was a crime. They are thankful, even though our current rulers are pretty much aligned with Iran and its policies, but to them it was a political change somehow. So we don't only have this imperial narrative imposed on us, but also the state narrative. And what we can do as writers, I think, as authors, as producers, is to try and record these fragmented shards that remained with us, and present them as a counter narrative. I think so much has been written about Iraq after 2003, but most of it is related to broader issues of politics, of security, and most of it was written by, even though some brilliant authors like the late Anthony Shadid and others, but people my generation, there are the novels of Sinan Antoun, there is Ahmed Saadawi, who wrote Frankenstein of Baghdad, which was more focused on, again, the spectacular violence, which unfortunately can be commodified and has been commodified by so many. But I want my own stories, my own, how did I walk and what did I see, even if it's gruesome and grotesque at times. But I also want to say this. I want to say that, for example, the footbridges where I lived were amputated, and the kids couldn't cross, and they would die trying to cross the highway. So these simple stories that are lost somehow, and someone has to write something. And I think that's how I see myself as a writer, being able to stitch a few readable words. That's the duty that I try to fulfill, hopefully.
I mean, I think it brings up, it brings up a question that I think we all ask ourselves to a certain extent, because, you're talking about there's the spectacular violence, right? And then there are the small violences that are done every day. And it's this idea that writing to a certain extent memorializes not violence, but it memorializes injustice and indignity. And, that there is a need to write that down and to say that this happened and that happened. And, this person was done wrong unto them, and this got me. And it's like, Saleem, you write about this. What I find is really interesting about your book review is you kind of bring your own experience into it, and there is very much the sense of sadness of like what could have been in remembering Palestine, in remembering, that everybody's history is like, okay, so when the Nakba happened, some people fled north to Lebanon, some people fled west to Jordan, some Palestinians remained, others, went from certain villages to Gaza, let's say. So there's this idea that the Nakba is this central kind of explosion out of which everything else emanates, right? And in your essay, there is this, you talk about your own family and you also talk about Sidi and Sawalha's family as this almost like a history of what if this had not happened? Can you talk about the relationship between memory and regret in this kind of Palestinian narrative, and how, like how to write around that? Is that something that you've thought about?
For sure. I mean, I think what was really interesting to me about the book was it was a collaboration. So it was a collaboration between Sirine's memories as told to Sami Hermes, and he was then bringing in a lot of the factual research and making sure, and that was something that I think he wrote about in the beginning of the memoir, that he wanted her memories to be informed by research. And I think this is I think it's a very Palestinian thing where we feel the need to always, like, our memories feel very unreliable because we're gaslit into thinking that things that happened to us and things that our grandparents have told us have happened did not actually happen. So there's like this sense that we know that memories are important, and we know that memories are often more truthful than the historical fact that we're told. But we also feel like the memories alone are not enough, and that we need to kind of go, whether through legal means or through history, and kind of bring up facts and bolster that. So I think in the memoir, it worked really well because you had this very beautiful interplay between the personal reflection and the more political context. But for me, I think my path, you mentioned in the beginning when you were introducing me that I kind of Palestine by way of Lebanon and with a bit of Amman. Actually, it's more complicated than that, because there's also, my dad left during the Lebanese Civil War and went to Baghdad, where he met my mother, who's half Iraqi. And I think, as you know, my family history is so much a story about displacement, because they then had to leave Iraq and go to Kuwait. And then during the war in Kuwait, they had to leave again, especially because my mother is Iraqi, my father's Palestinian. Those were like the two worst nationalities to be in post-91 Kuwait. So my Palestinianness has kind of created this domino effect of displacement. And there is always this sense of what if, like, what if 1948 didn't happen? What would my life have looked like? And I often think this as well when I meet other people who are from the hometown where my grandparents were from in Palestine, because then I wonder, would we have been neighbors? Would we have been friends? That kind of centrality is not there. And I think it's a really hard thing to deal with, because on the one hand, remembering what happened is a key sort of part of Palestinian resistance, is holding on to that memory and that connection to the land. And at the same time, it is also a continuous painful reminder of what has been lost. And so I think trying to live with those two things is very hard practical day-to-day basis somehow.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think, this idea of what if and regret, I feel is very much is a very much of an Arab melancholy, because the what if of Palestine feels like it's something, again, it's very regional. And I mean, I feel it very much as a Lebanese. Like, what would this country have looked like if it wasn't for the Nakba, if it wasn't for 1948? But even beyond that, what would our entire region have looked like if it wasn't for colonialism, if it wasn't for Sykes-Picot, if it wasn't for the redrawing of the boundary? So this idea of like, had we not, were we not, if we hadn't, there is very much like of a kind of regret of the past, and of a kind of holding on to past glories, which, Asmaa, I feel Egypt is kind of like the shining beacon of that to a certain extent. I mean, I can't say that. We also have an Iraqi with us, and I think all of these, like, the old Araqa of this idea of, like, the cradle of civilization, and these places that once were and now have kind of come apart. And what I find really interesting is, in a way, compared to everybody whose pieces are about remembering, your piece is about the present, like how we look at the present and how we are storing it. This is the way that I saw it very much. And it's, Saleem mentioned gaslighting, and that's kind of, that's the modern word for it. But that's your piece to me is like so much about, I mean, you say this, but although I thought about it a little bit differently. You say, when the tragic meets the absurd, the most pernicious form of oppression is the denial of common sense. And I feel like this is something that we are all living now as we watch the news that is coming out of Gaza, and we are being told, for example, that the things that we're seeing are not actually happening. And it's this, there is something very truly oppressive in being told that, no, ignore what you are seeing. These are not settlers that are stomping food aid, and not, this is not what's happening. It's actually this that's happening. And so can you talk a little bit about that, like this idea of like how that absurdity, you reconcile yourself to it living in Egypt? Do you feel yourself, because living through history, and then you're thinking, how do I record this? Even as the present is unfolding, the state narrative is coming to come and say, no, actually, this is not what's happening. This is not what's,
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's funny that you talk about like recording it in the present, because I actually wrote this essay in pieces at different points in time, right? Like, so many of these reflections came to me and I wrote them down, and then I put it together, and then I rewrote it. And a lot of this I wrote actually not recently. I wrote, there are parts of this that I wrote like 2 years ago, right? And in putting it together for the Markaz review, finally kind of piecing it all together, what was really, really on my mind was what was happening with Gaza, right? The essay is not about Gaza, but that was really, really at the forefront of what I was thinking about, because to me, it was reliving all of these things that I had written about before, right? And what I was trying to express is that, violence is, the repercussions of violence, or the reach of violence, goes far, far beyond where it is committed or perpetrated, right? You can be completely physically unharmed, right? Thousands of miles away from where a genocide is happening, or from where people are being dragged down the streets and lynched and killed and all these things. But you can feel the violence because you're not even allowed to point at it and call it violence, right? And I'm at a moment here where, I'm very embedded in like US academia right now, and, the student protest movement. And, I'm being told on a daily basis that by protesting, by actually calling for Palestinian liberation, they're actually calling for genocide. And it's absurd. It's quite absurd. Nobody in their right mind could think that and take that seriously without the layers of bias that are attached to that, right? So I, even in conversations with, you know, my family about what's happening in Gaza, every time I'm on the phone and I hear this crazy absurd thing, I say, العلبة فيها فيل, you know, there's an elephant in the box. Like, it's this Orwellian concept, but it's even more absurd than saying 2 + 2 = 5, because that actually requires like a mathematical equation, putting in effort to figure out that 2 + 2 does not equal 5. This is even more obvious. And I wanted to write something that was also embedded in our culture, right? Like, this is the pop culture that I grew up with, right? I used to watch these movies as a child, and there it was, so clear and so obvious and so absurd, and yet I'm reliving it over and over. And I think what I was trying to express in this essay is that you struggle with these multiple layers of gaslighting, whether it's gaslighting at home, right? Or, you know, I grew up in Egypt, and I feel very betrayed by kind of the alteration of these memories. But then you kind of go abroad, or you know, take your life somewhere else, and there's a different form of gaslighting, and you're kind of stuck between these two things. And at the end, I feel like one of the ways you can cope is to embrace the absurdity, like one up the absurdity, kind of, right? Whether that's that's why I kind of ended with that, the dinosaur song, but even kind of in the part that I wrote about Giulio Regini, the Italian student, and kind of like imagining, oh, like, okay, let's go with the state narrative, or let's go with the official narrative. Let's imagine how this actually could be true, and it's completely, absolutely absurd. So I feel like that's one way of kind of resisting or claiming the narrative, is to embrace the tool of absurdity, almost to kind of challenge that. So
that's very interesting. Can you say a little bit about that? You mean embrace the idea of absurdity, as in like, okay, let's take you at face value and kind of push this as far as we can push it and see what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, again, I feel like it's my Egyptianness speaking, right? Like, we as Egyptians are known for just turning everything into a joke. You know, every tragedy, you know, is made fun of as a way to cope. This is how we cope with tragedy. It's how we cope with loss. And yeah, so that's kind of, again, to go back to the Giulio Regini piece, that's how I try to embrace it. You know, like, okay, you're telling me this person, you know, was hit by a car. Okay, let's imagine how he could have sustained all of these injuries if he was truly hit by a car. And there is no way to imagine it without being completely fictional, right? Like, it's very clear, right? Or let's imagine kind of the scenario where, oh, this, you know, a gang of thieves abducted this person. Okay, why would they be torturing him for days on end? Are they method actors? Like, it's a way of revealing the absurdity for what it is, I think. And satire can often be a really good tool for that. And I think it's something that people can connect with, and it's both. And I mean, it's tragic that you have to go that far, but when you're being gaslit to that extent, or you're being told there's an elephant in the box, I think that's okay. Elephant, let me conjure the elephant, right? So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that's very funny and very clever, and it's also, as you said, it's one of the ways of dealing with absurdity, you know, which is satire. It also makes me think, you know, what you're saying about like taking it and reconstructing it makes me think of, and it's funny that both you and Mai are reading things through a film, you know, through the idea of a film, through the way that I felt like holding it up as a prism and kind of using it as like a dialogue point, which is, you know, I also found that like one of the cool little similarities between these things. But this idea of objective versus subjective memory, I think, is something that is brought up by all of your pieces in very different ways. Of course, there's no such thing as objective memory, but let's say archival forensic memory, like the memory that we think is, this is what happened without any emotion. You know, what you were talking about, Saleem, this idea that like, oh, as Palestinians, we have to go back to the archive, we have to back it up with facts on this date, on this, that, you know, at this time, etc. I'm sure if you guys probably have read by now Adania Shibley's Minor Detail about like trying to reconstruct very specifically by going back to an archive, you know, this date and time. And yeah, it seems to me at the same time, both Nabil and Asmaa are talking about, and you know, Mai, in your reading of the Mbantua people, is this idea that it's actually the perforations of memory and the gaps where these things exist is where we, like, these are the spaces in which solidarity can happen, in which rewriting can happen, in which you can kind of embrace this idea that, well, okay, there's no such thing as an objective memory, but here's the subjective memory. Can you guys, does anybody have anything to say about that or to comment about that? Because then I have like another follow-up question to it.
I mean, I think, sorry, who?
No, go ahead, May. I'll go after you.
Okay, I mean, I think so. When I was watching this film and feeling that, you know, sort of almost this sort of visceral response to the really self-involved, you know, the way that these two characters were self-involved with their personal memories, it felt shameful to me in this moment where all of this is going on. And yet, when we think about it, to also disavow our subjective memories, I think, there is also something just wrong about that. Kind of building on what Saleem was saying, you know, that it's unfair that Palestinians have to verify every detail of their lives, their existence, their history, their genealogy, their presence, right, on the land, in order to say we exist, that we have a right to exist, we have a right to humanity. That's not right. And if that involves, you know, claiming a subjective memory, that subjective memory has to be somehow sort of threaded, let's say, or layered with the communal. It cannot be discounted. So I feel like they're just like the relationship between memory or remembering and forgetting, which I'm thinking now more and more of the relationship between remembering and forgetting as being two sides of the coin of memory, you know, that these things work together, that at some moments forgetting is a necessity, because as many people in the issue were saying, you know, one cannot live. How do we even live with these memories that are spinning in our minds? That there has to come a point, if you want to write, if you want to create, if you want to just live, you're going to have to forget, you know, so that the memories of your, whether it's personal or again, more broadly, political or your national, there's going to be an element of forgetting if one wants to go on. And I think that there's also then a similar kind of interplay between objective and subjective memory, or archival, let's say forensic versus, you know, the more personal, that there has to be a kind of give and take between the two. And that we know that history can never be the sort of factual, objective creation. It's always going to be written from some kind of perspective, the perspective of the victor, you know, you can be more aware of your position, make that clear as you write, you know, and new kinds of histories do that, certainly. But at the same time, there's always going to be this interplay. We see the same with the personal and the political, you know, as we know well. So I feel like there's a kind of a relationship between the two that we can't think of it in these either or terms, or as these kind of divided terms, because that's not really how it works.
Yeah. Saleem, you had.
Yeah, you know, when at various points before my grandmother died, I would ask her about what memories she had from Palestine before 1948. And she would have sometimes the most, like, sometimes very clear memories of things that were very sort of, okay, we left at that point, and then my brother was working with the British Mandate, and so he was able to get us a truck, and like these very detailed things. And at other times she would have memories like, my father used to store the watermelon under my bed because it would keep it cool during the summer. And like, I think it's really interesting what we choose to remember and what shapes what we choose to remember. And I think and this is maybe the novelist side of me, is I'm really interested in that, in how, because memories is so much also about the interplay between the present and the past, and how we understand ourselves, or how we want to understand ourselves in the present moment. And also how we choose to remember in order to absolve ourselves, or forgive ourselves, or justify ourselves. And I think when I think about writing my fiction, how characters remember the past is something that I think comes out very strongly in all the characters that I write, and I'm really interested in that. But I think also as well, it raises the question of agency. I mean, are we in control of our memories, or are there deeper forces inside of us or outside of us that shape how we remember? And I think as a fiction writer, that's something that I've always been very interested in. I think all my characters kind of memory and how they remember things is something that I think I return to often in my fiction. But I don't necessarily have the answers. I just have a lot of questions.
Nabil, I feel like you wanted to say something.
I was just thinking, in Iraq, the wound is still open to some extent for so many. The blow of the first trauma is still leaving some bewildered, and then there are many guardians on the memory in the state from each faction, from each political side, whichever one you're on. It is, yeah, I was just thinking of how, well, I'm going on to Baghdad on Monday to do some research, some reporting, and part of it will be about how people, for example, walk the city and how they experience this encounter between former sites of crime scenes and the hunting and the affects that these sites awaken in them. Whether they are choosing willingly also to forget if they are able to. And then there's this forced forgetting on the part of the state. You know, Iraq is undergoing these mega construction projects that are overdue. You know, there's a new building for the central bank that was erected, designed by the late Zaha Hadid, British Iraqi architect, that is, as my mentor and friend Robert Weston says, as if a phallus on the riverbank, and then you just cannot say that the country is not progressing. But how do you counter this main narrative that you know, when you denude what progress is really is, you know, it's rather than an advancement towards something good, but, you know, in the Benjaminian sense, and how Adorno wrote it, is, you know, there is a pile of wreckage that is everywhere, even though under the veneer of a new spectacle that is very calculated again. Nevertheless, you can still see the many forms of ruination that are happening still, you know, hunting the existence of people. That is a long answer that did not answer anything.
I mean, it's like Saleem said, I don't think there's any answers. It's all questions, you know, when it comes down to this, because it's, yeah, there are no answers to that, especially as you said, when the trauma is still ongoing, which is, you know, it is in a lot of different places. So it's very, I mean, again, if I take the example of Lebanon and post-Civil War, and, you know, this idea of memory and how do we reconcile and how do we reconstruct? I mean, this is something that is not solved at all. And the question of memory and who gets to decide it, especially, you know, when you have literally the same people who committed massacres who are still in power, well, then how do you commemorate the victims of massacres if you can't name the perpetrator, because the perpetrator will, you know, report you to the cyber crimes division or whatever, for, you know, and besides that, it's also the idea of like reconstruction can also be a form of destruction that is like as violent as war itself, you know. So I don't think that there are any answers. I think that these are all questions. I mean, Asmaa, you can talk a little bit about reconstruction as a sign of progress, that is also a way of, I mean, I don't know if that's something you've thought about or want to talk about, or, but like.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of listening to Nabil speak right now. I was just thinking about there's a materiality to memory, right? In putting it down or constructing something, we are creating it. So in writing all of these essays, we are creating a certain version of this memory, and it's subjective, and it's I mean, even by the time you write something down, right, it's already been shaped by your feelings towards it and how you've processed it. So is it exactly as it happened? Did you think those exact things at those exact moments? Maybe, maybe not, but once you put it down, you've created that memory. And I think the same goes for like physical space, right? So like, for example, when I walked in Tahrir Square right now, it's full of pharaonic artifacts that were not there a few years ago. They were never there. But there will come generations after me who have no recollection of a Tahrir that was once before, and they'll think, those sphinxes that are now in Tahrir Square and the big obelisk, that is Tahrir Square. That is always that's always what it's been. So you're creating a memory. But even I'm thinking a lot about kind of remembrance. So I do a lot of work on colonial archives and things like that. And I spent some time in Nantes in France, going through French colonial archives there, and I paid a visit to the there's a memorial to the abolition of slavery in Nantes. If any of you have been there, I don't know, but it was celebrated as this very, very kind of progressive, groundbreaking thing, because it was the first memorial of its kind to be erected in a city that was actually pretty central to the slave trade. A lot of slaves passed through there. And I went to visit the memorial. First of all, I couldn't find it. I was like, where is the memorial? And it turned out it was underground. It's physically underground because it was meant to kind of mimic the like the slaves on a ship, kind of in the slave ship. So it's meant to be symbolic, but really what you've done is like you've hidden it from sight. You have to actually look for it to find it. And then when you go into the
You've
memorial,
literally buried it.
It's literally buried, right? And then when you go to the memorial, it's like all like these quotes about like freedom and equality, and it's like a timeline of the abolition of slavery. So what you've done is you've erected a memorial being like, good job, everyone, we've abolished slavery, but you're not actually talking about the slaves that like passed through these shores, who are, okay, to be fair, memorializing. They have these like little, if you walk down the Esplanade, there's like these little glass inserts with the names of some of the slave ships, but I mean, you're literally walking on them. You're not looking at them. You have no idea what they are. So in creating a memory, you've buried another, because what you're trying to create is really an image of progress, and that we moved past this, but we haven't, because we can't even face it. We can't even put it above ground. We can't even talk about what was actually there. The only thing we can talk about is that we're over that. We've ended it. So I think the material plays a really big role in shaping memories and creating them and shaping the narrative.
I mean, this
I
connects
think, yeah.
back to
Yeah.
this what we're witnessing also, and this is the decimation of Gaza. We've seen the decimation of Iraq, the decimation of Syria, all these regions. I mean, I can speak of Kuwait as well, where, and for different reasons, some for war, some for so-called progress, so like when you think of Kuwait pre-war, and then the sort of raising of the old city. And then you see this again after sort of to some extent after 1990, but then again in the 2000s, you destroy certain memory archives that people, like these locales, these places, these restaurants, or the ice skating rink, for example, in Kuwait, that hold on to, that you have memories in, are taken away from you. So in some sense, which goes back to what Saleem was saying, how much control do you have over what you remember? Just as a matter of course, we forget things, but then at the same time, when these places are transformed, like Tahrir Square, as you were saying, Asmaa, but also forcibly because of the annihilation caused by war or whatever it is, your memories also are taken away because the places vanish. So there's something also, as you're saying, a kind of materiality to our objects, the things that we own, that we either hold on to, and our memories are kind of triggered by those objects, or the places that we lose by force or by choice because, you know, we go away. It depends on, or the geography changes. All of these things, I think, contribute in some ways to the way we, just on an individual level, but also then on a national level, remember, and what we choose to remember, and how things get, you know, sort of monuments like you were describing, Asmaa, that are sort of figurative in a way, but really destroy some of the more personal or the more, I don't know, let's say one side of a different side of that memory sort of gets erased. So it's interesting how that works. And again, one can only think of it in relation to what's happening now in Gaza amongst all the ruins. You know, how will memory survive? You know, so that's something that's very much on my mind.
Yeah, I think it's on everyone's mind. Like Asma said, her piece is not about Gaza, but it's also about Gaza. And it's, in a way, everybody's work can be read through that kind of ongoing horror of what's happening. You know, reading Nabil's piece as well. Like I said, I was thinking a lot about Lebanon. I was thinking a lot about Iraq. You know, we all have different, and my dad was born and raised in Baghdad as well. So I've never been there, but like I also feel very kind of like a pull towards Iraq. My mom was born and raised in Cairo. So and neither of them, they're both Lebanese, but neither of them came to Lebanon until, like, you know, until they were, you know, more advanced in age. So in a way, these cities have also become part of my kind of this collective memory, right? And this idea, you reconstruct them in your head. You've never been there, but you have memories that are the retellings of what your parents have told you. And, you know, and I always had this idea that I wanted to go to Baghdad before, and then, you know, then it's like you feel like, have I missed the thing? Like, has the thing that my father, let's say, had memories of that I don't know very well because he's gone now and he can't tell me, are these the things that have now been destroyed, right? And it's very true what you're saying, Asma, about like the materiality of memory. And I was also thinking about like how memory can also become this inert thing when we turn it into just like a kind of memorialization. Like, I'm really struck by this idea of like, you're walking over people's names. You see that in Europe as well. They have the memory stones, like in you know, in Germany, where it's like right in front of the houses of, you know, the Jews who were taken to the camps. It's like, these are their names here, and you can like walk over them and kind of not really know or not even notice them. And it also feels like the thing that people do when they what's it called, it has like a very specific, you know, when they commemorate like, oh, we're now on indigenous land, and then they say the land acknowledgements, right? And then people just sort of go on. It's like, let's acknowledge that something else was here and then move on. So I really wonder how you take these extremely painful, you know, things that are still alive. And I think actually, Nabil, you do such a good job of the way that you write your essay, the way that you've layered it, by showing us how, you know, these very personal memories, even things like a photograph that is just of someone smiling, pulses with the living memory of a violence and of an entire history. And I really wonder, I mean, this is something that I ask myself also, like, how do you do justice to a memory in a way that really acknowledges all of the things that it breaks open for so many different people, without having it turn into like literally stepping on the names of people who died as you move on to somewhere else, you know? I don't know. That's something that I ask myself all the time. And it's something that feels really pertinent now, because already we're thinking about how do we memorialize all the death in Gaza as it's happening, you know? I don't know if you guys have any.
No, and I fear you know, if some certain group of people somewhere in a distant geography are, you know, granted the privilege of being named, I think in Gaza and elsewhere in Lebanon and even in Iraq, there are so many who remain nameless and unremembered.
And Syria, yeah, absolutely.
It's a hunted piece of the world, you know. Of course, not exceptionally so, but among others. But I want to say is you've been speaking about your father growing up in Baghdad. You know, I was born in 92 January, so until 2003, my earliest memories, you know, are from 98 or so. So I remember how the city looked like, how it smelled like. I remember playing on the streets, and I'm fearful because the last time I was there at 21, I was bidden farewell because couldn't just walk the street. You feel alienated. Not even the houses look the same anymore. You know, we had these small in the suburbs when the city started spreading in the 70s on, and these pieces of land were granted to professors, doctors, so on and so forth. We had these beautiful houses with gardens, with palm trees that are quintessential to the Iraqi landscape, and they are gone. Instead of these houses, you have small five or so hideous dwellings that don't look like anything you've ever remembered. And then there's the din of the generators that wherever you turn, you don't even have a fraction of time with yourself to converse with the city. And then I think writing about this photograph is a way of coming to terms with such loss, because I also live running away and you know, somehow of hiding the photograph, of not seeing the photograph, because it's daunting just to try and think and look and imagine what took place around or beyond the frame of the photo you have in hand.
You know, this makes me think as well about how we're witnessing what's happening in Gaza through our phones, but also a lot of the images and the videos that we're consuming disappear, either because they're taken down because they're too graphic, or they disappear because Instagram stories disappear after 24 hours. And so there's this like anxiety of where you know, I have very vivid memories of certain videos and images that I've seen over the last 7 months. But if I want to go and search for it, I can't find it because I just don't know what do you search for? Like, you know, body under a rubble. That, I mean, like, it becomes very difficult. But I have this friend who I follow on Instagram, and what she had started doing from the very beginning of the genocide was every day she would write down a list of everything that she witnessed. So these sort of like, you know, videos and images, she would basically describe them in words so that at least there was a written testimony every day of what she had seen. And I found that to be very powerful, both in terms of like consuming and understanding and memorializing in a very different way rather than this very gruesome way that's sort of visual, but one that relies more on imagination and writing. But I think it helped ease my anxiety of remembrance, because at least I knew that, you know, someone was writing parts of this down. Yeah.
Mm. That's super interesting. It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of what Mai wrote about. You wrote something about like I wrote this down because I thought it was like you said, survival demands vision, something in the shape of a half-remembered, half-forgotten dream. And I really loved this idea of, because it resides in the place of question, right? There isn't a singular way of remembering, there isn't a single, but it is this idea that like art exists again in these perforations of memory and tries to fill them in all of these different ways. So, you know, so we have like a drawing, let's say, instead of a photograph, and that's how we remember things. And it's sketched out with the hand of the artist in there. But I do think that one of the hardest things is really that, like you said, Saleem, like we want to remember. We feel like it's we feel like it's almost criminal to forget or to not witness or to not see, especially when you're seeing such incredible violence. And I really don't know where that line is between wanting to forget in order to, because like, again, like you said, May, war necessitates forgetting, because if we remembered all of it, we would be completely, I mean, even just the things that we've witnessed. Today I saw the worst thing that I've ever seen. I say that every day, but today truly it was the worst thing that I've ever seen. And it's like impossible to forget it. And at the same time, forgetting it feels like, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here, I think, because it's such a difficult question, about that balance of like, how much do you carry with you? If you think about memory as a kind of almost like physical thing, how much of it do you carry with you? I'm talking here just as an individual. We're not talking about like collective memory. That's like even a whole other thing. But
But
anyway,
Lina, I
sorry.
mean, this idea that it feels so shameful not to bear witness. I mean, it feels impossible not to carry that burden, or to at least attempt to carry that burden now in this moment. I feel like it for us, maybe in this part of the world, with feeling that we have such a stake in what's happening, it seems not possible to not bear witness to the most difficult things, and maybe forever, maybe for the rest of our life, we're not going to be able to let those things go. Maybe we will not be able to forget. But again, when you think again of what is going on, we can go back to that idea of the perfect day that nobody in Gaza has been able to have. I mean, we maybe have been able to have some perfect days, or at least perfect moments in a day, but they have not really been able to have that, and so then the least that we can do is to continue to bear witness, even if it means we're never going to be able to go back to a moment before what we've seen. I don't know. I feel like, and maybe then it will emerge somehow in our writing, in what we do, in what we're trying to do, if those of us who care about writing and scholarship or whatever it is, that in the imagination, something good will emerge. I mean, perhaps. But I don't know. For the moment, it feels like we're not at the point of forgetting now. It's just not the moment for that. I think I don't know. I feel like I can't do that. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I will also, like, reflect your own words back at you, which is another thing that you said in your essay that I think is like really, I mean, you were talking about obviously a very specific thing, but it brings up the larger question, where you said, never forgetting has unleashed inhumane mass destruction, right? And it is what we're seeing as a kind of memory project that is, the way that you put it, I thought was really, like it was really kind of perfect, because it's it's the fact that we're saying like we're never going to forget, this is the worst thing that ever happened, we're going to like enshrine this memory in such a way that anything can be justified, under its umbrella. So that's the flip side of it, right? Like, of course it's all about timing and when things happen and how things happen, but like, again, that's the other side of it. Like, that's the other danger of it, that when you create this kind of monument to a past trauma that becomes a present trauma,
I don't know. I hope, I mean, again, it feels so far away at the moment, like that we're not even in a position to be able to speak of that future in which that might happen, in which we might be in a position to say, okay, let's not turn this memory into this awful, hideous thing that the Palestinians were the victims of, so I don't know. I think we're just not there yet. We're not there yet. What needs to stop now is obviously this incredible genocide, and what happens after that is a story, or are events that then the Palestinians need to, make happen the way that they need to make happen. I don't know. I
Oh,
just feel
no.
like we're not there yet, you know?
Oh, I agree with you. I wasn't thinking like, how do we now in the present ensure that this doesn't happen again? But
Yeah.
just the fact that it already did, I think,
Yeah.
is something, you know, is something that is like a very powerful thing to keep in mind. You know,
Definitely.
it's the fact that it already has happened. I don't think, obviously, because the forces of power are so completely different. It's not like we can ever think of recreating, you know, this necessarily. Like, I don't think it's the memory in itself that has, you know, that is a bad thing or that can cause something like that. But I also think that I just find it very interesting that you juxtapose these two things together, not so much as a warning for the future, but as just a kind of way of rephrasing the present that really gives you pause, you know, by framing it through the idea of memory.
Yes, exactly.
I
Yeah.
think if I may add to what May was saying, I think it's the attempt that we are obligated to make for tomorrow is to shield a part of our conscience from the howls of sirens, from this cascading rubble that we are carrying everywhere in our heads, in order to do our own part in terms of uh, to the present, with regard to the present, let alone uh, you know, the past and the future.
I think keep reflecting on Saleem's friend on Instagram who's writing these things on a daily basis. And I think in a way that is a way to relieve yourself of the burden of being this repository of all these memories. And I think as writers, or as you know, anyone who does anything creative, whether you're making a film or you're podcast or you're writing or putting it out there, is not just a way of drawing attention to a cause, but I think it's also a way of relieving the pressure of having it all in your head for posterity, because you can't, you know, a single individual cannot hold that much and remain sane. So by kind of taking some of it and putting it back out there, whether it's through just like a few words jotted down in our journal or something that's more for public consumption, I think is a way to balance what May was talking about in her essay of remembrance and forgetting. You're not forgetting, but you're kind of putting it out there for someone else to remember. Almost you're I don't know, delegating. And I feel like that's a way of coping.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that was very beautiful too. This idea that we help each other carry memory, you know, uh, because it really does feel like a physical burden sometimes, you know, and when we carry memory for one another. And um May, you mentioned Alzheimer's actually in your, you know, you briefly mentioned that in your piece. And I mean, that's like a whole other you know, that like brings us off to a whole, because like obviously we're discussing such a massive topic, and a lot of our discussions have centered around like collective memory of trauma versus, you know, because that's what, you know, everybody has written about to a certain extent, and that's where we come from. And but I was reading something about, because my grandmother also had Alzheimer's, and it was, you know, very difficult. And you notice that when you're dealing with somebody who's forgetting, that a lot of people want to remind them and want to say, don't you remember this? Do you remember who I am? Tell me, what's my name? Do you remember? And then I was reading something where I forgot what it was, if it was like a medical essay or something, where they were saying the best way to deal with that actually is to go with what they remember, and not to make them constantly conscious of the fact that they're forgetting, because
Exactly.
you know, and to just sort of, and there was something really very beautiful about that felt like it's okay, like some things can be lost to memory and some things, but it really is about like caring for the present, and what the best way to get this person through the present without creating too much like trauma for them. And I feel like, you know, maybe there's a lesson there in general for like the way that we can deal with communal memory. But, you know, as you said, we're talking about so many different stages of, you know, like Iraq is not Lebanon, is not Gaza, is not Syria, is not Egypt, is not, because of, you know, all of the different stages of destruction and reconstruction that, you know, everybody is at. But yeah, I wonder, I mean, all of us are really discussing how do we deal with the present, right? Like as history is being made, how do we deal with the present? And yeah. Anyway, we've been talking for over an hour. So I'm going to see if we have any questions. Does anybody have any questions? We have 2 questions from Jordan, one that he has said, oh, forget about this question. He withdraws it. And then we have someone from Bangladesh, actually, Ajmin Al-Nakib. I'm sorry if I'm saying it wrong. He says, thank you, Saleem, and others from the panel for doing what you do for the people of Palestine, sending love and support all the way from Bangladesh, which is really beautiful. Thank you. So does anybody have any questions? Do you guys have any questions for each other before we sign off? I feel like we've barely touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so many, but there's just so many like pertinent and very vital questions. You know, people use this expression constantly, like this is an urgent thing, but this really feels like such an urgent topic and such urgent questions as we are, you know, memorializing the present itself, you know, watching history unfold and sort of trying to figure out how thinking for the future and the past and in the present, you know, I think that's what this kind of moment is forcing everybody into, this almost like temporal schizophrenia.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that it was such a pleasure to read all of the essays of, you know, Nabil, Saleem, and Asmaa, all of your essays. And what was so heartening was the sense that I felt in reading them, how connected I felt to your experiences and to the things that you were saying, which really did made me feel, you know, that we do share this community, you know, in one way or another, even though the experiences are different, the places are different, but that we do share this kind of connection. And, you know, Lina, you were saying that you're connected to Egypt and to Iraq. I mean, I'm connected to Iraq, I'm connected to Lebanon, you know, through family, to Palestine as well. And that we, you know, that this is really something that offers at least a degree of hope and solace in these dark times, you know, so that really meant a lot.
I feel very much the same way. And I also, you know, I loved all of your essays. I connected with all of them. And I also felt that they were speaking to each other across that. And I felt very much, you know, it was a solidarity both in thinking and in feeling and being able to, like, you know, thread these experiences together. But also, you know, both you and Saleem explicitly talked about how we create solidarity through recounting one another's stories and made that kind of explicit. And I also thought that that was like a really beautiful reminder. And it's like a thing that, you know, I come back to because that's the only solace that we have as we sort of watch so much crumbling around us. You know, I feel like the world as we know it is never going to be the same again. Maybe nor should it, you know, but yeah, that to me is like a sense of solace. So like, so thanks to all of you really for your work. And, you know, and it was like really a privilege to publish your work and, you know, to be able to see it in its first stages and then, you know, to see it in its final form. And yeah, that's really, thank you.
Thank you. No, I mean, it was, yeah, I echo what Mai and Lina said. It was, this conversation was also a pleasure, and it's given me a lot of food for thought. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel like anything I say is superfluous at this point because I also echo what everyone said, but like, thank you for providing a platform for this conversation and for this discussion and for this feeling of community. I think May said it so beautifully.
And again, lastly, I just want to say, you know, editors sometimes don't get enough credit as you know, laboring in the background. So thank you, Lina, also for your care and for giving us this platform, and also for the wonderful essays in the issue. You know, they for so many of us, you know, borders are inaccessible or impenetrable, and these writings are portals for us to travel. I mean, which is a shame, but even to the as near as close as you know, Kuwait or Egypt or Palestine, which is off limit, of course.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it also, I mean, I have to say that it just the, you know, the magazine itself and all of the writing from across the region, it makes me feel like, yes, we have, I don't even want to use the words Arab nationalism because we have, you know, kind of done away with that concept, but there is a kind of a solidarity of experience, if you will, through being from a region where, you know, there's a common language and a common understanding of grief. That to me, whenever I see us connecting around that, like it really makes me feel very, I don't know, it's hope even is maybe too hollow a word for it, but it is the sense of like that, you know, you have somewhere to, you have a hand to hold. Like it's I'm actually thinking of the Arabic of like fina nishbuk idayna, like we can sort of network our hands together, you know, if we want to, if we, or entangle our hands together. So anyway, thank you, Mai, thank you, Saleem, thank you, Asmaa, thank you, Nabil. Thank you, Megan, who is also laboring in the background, who has made this Zoom possible. Thank you to everybody who attended the talk. I just wanted to say that currently Jordan El-Grabli, who is our editor-in-chief, is on a book tour promoting TMR's first anthology called Stories from the Center of the World. So for you guys, especially in North America, maybe they're coming to a bookstore near you if you want to check that out. Yeah, so it's here in the chat. You can check out all of the locations and you can RSVP on the link that Jordan just provided. So anyway, thank you so much to everybody. And it was really a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night. Bye. Bye.